I'm so glad that everyone who is on this call has made this decision to spend this time with us. I'm grateful that you have decided that this is important work for you to be doing today. Like so many Vermonters, I have felt so incredibly concerned about the direction of our country and the health of our democracy. And my office hears every day from Vermonters who want to know what more that we can each do to stand up to the Trump administration as it repeatedly acts in violation of our constitutional right and our constitutional law. One of the most meaningful actions I've been able to take as a member of the House Judiciary Committee is joining my Democratic colleagues in direct oversight of immigration enforcement. I went to Chicago in October during Operation Midway Blitz, and then again to Minnesota in January during Operation Metro Surge. I knew that being on the ground both in Minnesota and Chicago was the best way for me to truly understand what was going on. And I saw the shocking reality that local law enforcement was outnumbered by 3-to-1 by federal agents in Minnesota. And what we heard is that ICE and Border Patrol were rounding up anyone who was a person of color or had an accent. Stephen Miller, the president's advisor, has set a quota for how many people will be rounded up each day to be detained. And Minnesota was not chosen because of immigration concerns. This is about abuse of power. It's about terrorizing a community and trying to break all of us so that we will submit. And I know so many Vermonters stand with me when I say we will not submit. When we were in Minnesota, we heard chilling accounts of there being holding cells in the immigration facility there in Minneapolis to hold American citizens. And I just want to remind everybody, it's an immigration detention facility. It's not designed to hold American citizens who are exercising the First Amendment rights. Now, while my oversight in these communities made clear the cruelty and the violation of rights committed by ICE, it also demonstrated the incredible power of the communities to stand with their neighbors and to help protect the Constitution for all of us. The people of Minnesota have figured out ways to tell people where ICE and Border Patrol are. They documented the abuses, and as you know, they captured the killing of 2 American citizens. And it forced the American public to see what was happening and to not look away. They were also able to rally around families and school communities to ensure that needs of those families and those kids are being met during a time of incredible fear. They turned out in the streets en masse in protest, in peaceful, strong protest to demonstrate their commitment to the rule of law and to our stated principles as a nation. I came away from these visits with clear lessons learned, both for us here in Vermont and for people across the country. And we have to build a coalition across the country of people who desperately believe in the Constitution, the rule of law, and the separation of powers. And also a community of people who are willing to act. And I want us to all be building that team together. This is a time for all of us to expand our circles and to work together to create a society that we want and that we deserve. I serve on a subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee in the House. This is the subcommittee specifically looking at issues related to the Constitution. And I know from my work there that the Constitution can sometimes feel distant from our daily lives. It can feel like an abstract idea that we're not living up to as a nation, or it can feel like an outdated piece of paper that doesn't seem relevant to us today. So I want to help educate and inform Americans so we all understand that we have a stake right now today in this document. And we have to realize and harness our power as individuals, but also the power of our communities. And I was so inspired by the thousands of Vermonters who participated in the ICE out protests, and by all of the people who have reached out to my office asking how they can do more in this critical time. So now is the time, more than ever, to be connecting with our neighbors and to be ready to freely and regularly and creatively exercise our First Amendment rights. I'm hosting this conversation today to help Vermonters access good, solid information and resources to help you figure out how you and your community will meet this moment. Along with my staff, I'm also staying in close connection to the individuals and organizations most impacted by ICE activity in Vermont, including immigration serving organizations, local and state government, and law enforcement. I believe that Vermont is learning the lessons of Chicago, Minnesota, and all the other cities that have faced this brutality. And we're taking steps to make our state and our communities strong in protecting the constitutional rights of all of us. Now, one more note before I turn this training over to Hillary Rich at ACLU. I want to talk for a moment about election integrity, because I'm hearing from a lot of Vermonters that they're concerned about the safety and security of our elections here in Vermont. And I wanted to let you all know that I met with Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanzis yesterday and her staff. And I want to assure you that she's doing everything that she can to guarantee the security of our elections. Her team is working overtime, as are all of the 247 town clerks around our state, professionals who know what they're doing. If you have time and capacity, reach out to your town clerk and find out if they need more volunteer poll workers. And at the very least, let them know that you're so grateful for all the work that they do to protect our access to the ballot here in Vermont. I also wanted to remind everyone that here in Vermont, you can go to the Secretary of State's website and track your ballot. You can do that as soon as you fill out your ballot, whether you vote absentee or whether you are, in person. You can track your ballot and make sure that it's being recorded. When it comes to making sure that we are all educated on our constitutional rights, there is no better partner than the American Civil Liberties Union. And I'm grateful to be joined today by Hillary Rich, the senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Vermont. Hillary joined the ACLU of Vermont as its first legal fellow in October of 2021. She received her law degree from Cornell Law School, where she focused on the intersection of immigrants' rights and gender justice. Prior to joining the ACLU of Vermont, Hillary represented asylum seekers and detainee families at the U.S. southern border as an immigration staff attorney with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. So obviously, very, very experienced in the work that she is doing. Hillary, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today, joining us and lending your time and expertise to the entire team, my entire team, and to all of Vermonters who've tuned in. So thank you to you and to ACLU Vermont for working tirelessly to protect our civil liberties. We are so grateful for you and all that you've done. Thank you so much, Hillary, and take it away.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the opportunity to present today. Public education is such an important part of the ACLU's mission, and talking to people about their rights is frankly one of my favorite parts of my job. And as you've highlighted, right now more than ever, it is so crucial that people feel empowered to exercise their rights to keep themselves and each other safe. Now, this presentation is really meant to outline the rights that apply to everyone who calls Vermont home. And so for those who want a deeper dive into the resources for non-citizens and immigrants specifically, I encourage you to check out the ACLU website. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the content, I want to give you a welcome and a few disclaimers. This presentation is for information purposes only. It is not legal advice. You should always consult with a lawyer if you are arrested or in removal proceedings. And under the current administration, policies and practices are changing very quickly. Now, as we'll discuss, that does not mean your rights are changing that quickly, but the tactics of federal immigration enforcement do change. So this information in this presentation is accurate as of 12:12 p.m. Eastern Time on February 19th, 2026. And I also want to be very upfront. Even if you know your constitutional rights and exercise them perfectly, immigration officers, as we have seen, might not honor them. You should never use force or physically resist, even if you know those officers are in the wrong. The opportunity to challenge that misconduct comes after, and we will talk about how to do that. So basically today, I'm going to tell you what your rights are, but you are going to have to decide for yourself when and how to exercise them based on your circumstances, your identity, and your risk tolerance. Next slide, please. So we're going to be covering a lot of information today. The first thing I want to talk with you all about is why asserting your rights matter when I've just flagged that they might not be honored. We're also going to discuss who actually enforces immigration law. Then we're going to spend some time talking about our basic rights that apply to everyone, regardless of citizenship status. We're going to discuss a few situations when you're going to be applying those rights. I'll also discuss with you best practices for protests, including how to prepare, what to bring and not bring, and safety tips. And then we're going to talk about arrests and what comes after. So what to do if you are arrested by police or ICE, also how to safely record ICE interactions, and how to report abuses. Next slide, please. So at the outset, why does asserting your rights actually matter? We know that there is a large gap between what your rights are on paper and how they are or are not being respected in reality. So you may understandably be wondering, why does any of this actually matter? And I have a couple responses to that. And the first one is, when it comes to your rights, you actually really have to use them or lose them. If you don't assert your rights when they are being challenged, you often can't get them back. So for example, if you consent to a search, it is that much harder to challenge that search in court down the road. However, you can always change your mind, even if you don't assert your rights at the beginning of an interaction. You can assert them at any point during them. And if you do change your mind, you should express this clearly and unequivocally. Another important reason to assert your rights is for law enforcement accountability. If we all exercised our rights, that would really slow down a lot of the improprieties that we are seeing in the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. And finally, the reason to assert your rights is because some other people just can't. Depending on identities and circumstances, sometimes other people can't safely assert their rights for themselves. So it's all our collective responsibility to hold that line when we can. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk a little bit about who enforces immigration laws, because the answer to this might surprise you a little bit. Next slide, please. So to start, immigration loves using acronyms, and there's a few that I want you all to learn. The first is DHS. This is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and they are essentially the parent agency of ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, who basically operate as the immigration police inside the US. We also have CBP, Customs and Border Protection, who are also known as Border Patrol, and these are the immigration police that operate at the border. Now, when I say at the border, Border Patrol interprets their jurisdiction as extending to 100 miles from the border, which for Vermonters means that almost our entire state is within what Border Patrol deems its jurisdiction, except I think for a small chunk of Brattleboro. So it is not uncommon to see ICE and CBP working together. And some people think that that might be problematic, but they're actually part of the same overall agency. We also often use ICE, Border Patrol interchangeably. And for purposes of this presentation, that's fine. Next slide, please. Now, I want to be clear that immigration law is civil law. It is not criminal law. And in Vermont, state and local law enforcement agencies are responsible for enforcing state criminal law, not civil immigration law. Only federal immigration agencies can enforce immigration law. And I don't need to memorize this chart, and this is going to be recorded. Slides will be available afterwards. But I want to point out why this distinction actually matters in a state like Vermont. And this is because Vermont state and local law enforcement actually generally cannot ask about your immigration status unless it's part of the underlying crime they're investigating for something like human trafficking, where you would need to know potentially the status of someone. So state and local law enforcement includes local police, sheriffs, and state troopers. And they are actually limited in what they can ask about immigration status by design. In Vermont, we are protected by something called the Fair and Impartial Policing Policy. Now, in other states, you may have heard about arrangements like 287G agreements, where state and local law enforcement are sort of deputized to be immigration enforcement. Vermont has gone the opposite direction. Under our fair and impartial policing policy, the state has actually limited even what information Vermont law enforcement is providing to the federal government. So generally, you should not be asked by state or local police what your immigration status even is. Now, on the other side, we have federal immigration enforcement. They can and do ask about immigration status. This includes ICE, CBP, many subdivisions, and it also includes, under President Trump, other agencies that didn't previously do this, like the FBI, DEA, Marshals, Bureau of Prisons. Now, I also want to be clear that sometimes ICE will lie if you ask them what agency they're from. And sometimes they will say they are police or just be wearing, a badge or a vest that says police. So it's really important that you know who you are dealing with. But since it might not be readily apparent, throughout this presentation, I'll often just speak about law enforcement generally, and I'll clarify when there's an important distinction. Next slide, please. Let's talk about our basic rights, and these apply to everybody regardless of citizenship status. Next slide, please. Importantly, at the outset, let's be clear. The president does not have unlimited power over immigration, even if sometimes he likes to act like he does. There are rights that we all have when you live within the US, and they are protected in the US Constitution, in federal law, which includes statutes that Congress passes, agency regulations, and executive orders, and also state law. Vermont has its own constitution and its own state laws. So executive orders, even though they are often seem really dangerous and can have real consequences, they often actually don't change the law right away. Executive orders can't override the Constitution, and oftentimes they're really performative and don't actually immediately change the law like they imply. And even when they do try to change the law, they're often going to be challenged in court. And even in situations where the courts fail to uphold the law and a federal protection is removed, sometimes state law can fill the gaps. So in my work, oftentimes we will see an executive order drop, and there is a real sense of panic and uncertainty about, has the law changed? And that panic and uncertainty is oftentimes the point. So I want everybody always to take a deep breath and not just assume that the president can take away our rights with the stroke of a pen. Next slide, please. Let's get a little deeper into what those constitutional rights held by all actually are. So regardless of citizenship status, we all have the right to freedom of speech. And that includes, the general speech that we all think about, but also talking about and publicizing truthful information about law enforcement. So, there are certain organizations or hotlines where you can report ICE activity that you're witnessing. And that is completely legal. That is protected by the First Amendment. It is also, under free speech, a protected right to educate people about their rights. So what I am doing now, talking to you about your rights, that is completely legal. And the government is forbidden from retaliating against you for exercising that free speech. Now, the First Amendment does not give you the right to say anything, anytime, anywhere without consequences. And there are some exceptions to the First Amendment. So for example, it's illegal to help people violate the law. It's also illegal to give people legal advice if you are not a lawyer. We also all have the right to peaceful assembly. That means we can protest and criticize the government, join groups that are doing that. But if protests turn violent, they are actually no longer protected by the Constitution. And police and other government officials are allowed to place certain restrictions on protests. These are often called time, place, and manner restrictions. Now, if organizers to a protest get a permit in advance, that means they've already resolved those time, place, and manner restrictions. But not all protests actually have to be permitted. But if you don't have a permit, you may have to negotiate those restrictions with the government in real time. Now, even for peaceful, lawful protests, law enforcement can still monitor them. They can enforce laws and intervene for public safety, but they are forbidden from using excessive force or retaliating against people for peaceful demonstrations. You also have the right to remain silent. Now, generally, that means you don't have to answer questions about your name, your place of birth, your immigration status, or your criminal history. Now, this does not give you the right to lie or to provide false documents. And there are exceptions to remaining silent. So, for example, at the border, when you are, heading to Canada from Vermont, pass through a checkpoint, you're going to be asked questions. That is Border Patrol's right. If you are a lawful permanent resident, there are certain questions that you also might answer. And Vermont is also something called a stop and identify state. And that means under state law, law enforcement can demand identification under certain circumstances, but that authority is not absolute. So you are generally required to identify yourself only if an officer has reasonable suspicion that you have or are about to commit a crime. And also, you might have to identify yourself if you are a driver during traffic stops. So if you are operating a motor vehicle, you must provide your license, registration, and proof of insurance if an officer asks, because operating a vehicle is not a constitutional right. You also all have the right to be not be detained or arrested without a valid reason. Law enforcement can't stop or arrest you without some evidence you've broken the law. And whether that's a brief stop or an arrest or detention, there's a growing amount of evidence that officers have to use in order to actually be detaining you. Of course, like all of these, there are exceptions, like at ports of entry or checkpoints. And also importantly, ICE might try to get evidence during an interaction by questioning you or getting consent to searches. So if you are stopped by ICE, they might realize like, oops, I didn't really have that reasonable suspicion to stop you in the first place. And that's when sometimes you'll see officers asking questions to try to get more information to justify their stop after the fact. And that's why it's important to remember you have that right to remain silent, and you can always ask if you are free to leave. You also have the right to refuse consent to a search of your body, your home, or your belongings. Law enforcement can't search you, your car, or your house without your consent or a warrant, and you don't have to consent to that search. Now, again, there are exceptions for emergencies, or if you're being arrested, law enforcement's probably going to pat you down for a weapon, even if you don't consent to that. You also have the right to ask for a lawyer if you're arrested or detained. There is a right to a court-appointed lawyer in criminal proceedings if your income is below a certain amount. And you also have the right to hire your own lawyer in immigration proceedings. Now, I said at the outset, even if at the start of an interaction with law enforcement, you didn't assert your rights, you can still assert them at any time. There's not, at the beginning is best, but at any time, you can still remember your rights and use them. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about how to actually apply our rights in some different situations. Next slide. First, what if ICE comes to your door? I'm sorry, could you go back? Thank you. So if ICE knocks, they may say that they are police. They might not be wearing uniforms and they might be wearing a badge that says ICE, maybe not. But you can always ask for identification and you can ask to see a warrant. And you do not have to open the door unless the officers have a valid warrant, which begs the question, what is a valid warrant? Next slide, please. So, a valid warrant must have a judge's name and signature, the person's name or address who is going to be searched or seized, the date and the time frame, and it can't be expired, the name of the agency conducting the search or arrest, and if it's a search warrant, it also has to have a description of the items being searched. And if any of these pieces of information are missing or expired, that is not a valid warrant. Now, you might have heard of something called administrative subpoenas, administrative warrants, or ICE warrants. Administrative warrants are not the same as a valid judicial warrant. Now, there's some key differences here. They are often issued by DHS, so you want to look for a DHS seal or form number. They might be signed by an immigration officer or an immigration judge, not a federal judge. And they might state that their authority comes from immigration law, something called the INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, instead of a court. So next slide, please. And I know this is a little bit hard to see, but again, slides will be available afterwards so you can zoom. So just to go over a few items. Now, if the officers do have a warrant and you've requested to see it, they can slide it under the door or they can hold it up to a window. You still don't have to open your door. And you want to check the following. Does the warrant have the right name, correct address, current date, signed or stamped by a judge? So let's look at these two examples on the screen. On the left, we are seeing a judicial warrant. We can see at the top that it's from a U.S. district court, which is a federal court. We've got a name and address, check to see if it's correct, information about the person or search items, the date, check that's not expired, and signed by a judge. On the right, we see something that looks more like an administrative warrant. It is issued by the Department of Homeland Security, not a federal court, not for search or seizure. It's the warrant for the arrest of an alien, which is the derogatory term that's used in immigration law for non-citizens. And we can see it's not signed by a court. It is signed by an immigration officer. Now, you want to check. So check to see if it is something more like what's on the left or on the right. And even if it is a judicial warrant, is all that information still correct? And if not, you have the right to refuse that search or seizure. You do not have to open the door or let the officers inside. Instead, you want to clearly state, I don't consent to your entry. And now, you might have heard recently there was this leaked memo where ICE is suggesting that the administrative warrants are sufficient to enter without consent. No court has said that that is true. Now, whether or not ICE has a warrant, whether or not it's valid, you still have the right to remain silent. You can refuse to answer questions about where you were born or how you entered the US. You can refuse to show identity documents. And if you don't want to speak, you can always say, I choose to remain silent, or give the officers a know your rights card. If you do decide to speak, you also don't really have to open the door and invite them in. You can just step outside and shut the door behind you. Now, let's say officers didn't have a warrant or it wasn't a valid judicial warrant, and you said, I don't consent to your entry, and ICE forces their way in anyway. You still do not want to physically resist. You can clearly say, I do not consent to your entry, and you can ask a family member or a friend to actually record that interaction. And we'll talk later about how to safely record. You still don't want to lie or provide false information, and you can ask for a lawyer. Next slide, please. Let's talk now about what happens if ICE comes to your work or place of business. And the best tip that we have for you is to plan ahead. You don't want your staff or you to have to be navigating this in real time, because it's scary if law enforcement shows up, with weapons and demands entry. So first, you want to know what's private in your place of business. Every area of a business, a school, a church is not open to the public. And generally, ICE can access the public areas, just like the public, but not the private areas unless they have permission or a judicial warrant. So when you think about, what's private versus what's not, think about your mom. Your mom can walk into a restaurant that is open to the public, but she can't just walk into the kitchen. Your mom can walk into, the lobby of a doctor's office, but she can't just walk back into the exam room until she's invited. Those same kind of rules apply to ICE. With the exception, they can access those private areas only if someone agrees or they have that judicial warrant. Another tip that we have is to create a protocol in advance. And some recommendations for that is don't collect information that you don't need, because you can't disclose what you didn't collect. And except when required by law, it is typically not really necessary to know someone's immigration status. You've been listening to me talk for about 20 minutes now, and you don't know my immigration status, and this has been working out fine. You also can place signs indicating what areas are private versus what's not. And you'll also want to designate a point person if ICE arrives or requests information. And finally, recommend that you train staff. They should know, they should feel confident requesting identification, refusing to offer information, asking for a warrant, and calling that designee if ICE arrives. When thinking about how to navigate this, I actually like to think about my own parents, Nick and Holly Rich. Nick Rich worked in state government for 40 years. This man knows how to write a protocol. Nick Rich is someone that I would absolutely want to tap to think about what's private, what's not, mark it, write it down, come up with our preparedness plan. But Nick Rich is not confrontational. He is not necessarily the person that's going to want to, demand to see a warrant. And that's okay. On the other side, we have Holly Rich. Holly Rich is less interested in being the one to draft a protocol, but Holly Rich would have absolutely no problem telling ICE to show me a warrant or politely buzz off. She is ready to assert those rights on behalf of herself and for her friends and neighbors. So the reason I'm giving this example is because you got to figure out in advance who are your Nicks and who are your Hollies, because we all have a role to play in keeping each other safe, but it does not all have to be the same role. Some people are just not going to be comfortable and confident or safe doing those different parts, but we all have a part to play. Now, we've talked a lot about, private versus public spaces, but I also want to clarify, businesses can deny entry or service to anyone as long as that denial is not based on a protected ground like race, sex, or disability. Law enforcement or, ICE membership is not a protected class, and a business can therefore exclude ICE from entry unless that officer has a judicial warrant. So even in your public spaces, if ICE shows up and does not have a warrant, you can ask them to leave. Next slide, please. We're now going to turn to best practices for protests. And, I think sometimes people in this moment are also asking, when it comes to protest, why does this actually matter? And I think we have seen in the past couple months across the country, most recently in Minneapolis, that it actually can make a huge difference. Even in Vermont, we have already seen how effective protest and community activism can be. When ACLU of Vermont client Mohsen Madawi was detained in April, there was an outpouring of love and support for him, with protests even outside of the courthouse. And the court moved very quickly in that case and rightly demanded that the government justify detaining Mohsen. And when the government couldn't, the court ordered his release on bail. And more broadly, we know that this can work. There is a Harvard political science named Erica Chenoweth who studied over 300 nonviolent protests between the 1900 and 2006. And she found that sustaining a nonviolent active protest at 3.5% of the population is actually a threshold that made governments make change. So we know that when people are mobilized, we can make a real difference in what our government is doing. Next slide, please. So first, let's get into preparing for a protest. The first thing that you'll want to do is create a safety plan, including an emergency contact. Think about what could go wrong, decide on that emergency contact, and let them know your plans. You also want to think about any caregiving needs. You've got kids to pick up, pets that need to be let out, plants that need to get watered right away. If the worst happens and you're arrested, you want to make sure that those areas of your life can still continue. You also want to find a protest buddy with similar risk tolerance. That's, protests are just more fun with a buddy, but also for safety, someone you're accountable to each other to make sure that you're both safe. And you'll want to identify your exits, your meeting points, and event organizers and safety leads in advance. Another tip we have is actually to use permanent marker to write down important information like phone numbers on your body. If you are like me, the only phone number that you actually remember is like your childhood best friend. So you actually want to think about having an emergency contact, having any legal resources just written on your arm or somewhere that people can't see, just in case you're separated from your phone. Next slide, please. Now, what to bring and not to bring to a protest. Bring that permanent marker so you can write down numbers and so other people can. Pens in a small notebook. A photo ID, a US photo ID if you have one. Now, Under Vermont law, you are not required to carry an ID. And even if you give your name to law enforcement, like we talked about, you might have to if they have reasonable suspicion, you are not required to answer any other questions. Now, adult immigrants with green cards or other valid immigrant visas are required to carry their documents with them at all times. You'll also want to bring water, snacks, sunscreen, rain gear. As we know in Vermont, the weather can change the drop of a hat, so kind of be prepared for anything. Any essential medications in case you are arrested or detained and need to have those with you. Posters, and you also have the option of wearing masks, either for your own health safety or to protect your privacy. Now, what not to bring is just as important. Not a good idea to wear contact lenses. This is because for pepper spray or for other aerosols, they can actually be trapped behind those contacts and irritate your eyes even more. You don't want to bring weapons, just bad idea to bring weapons to a protest, even if you have a permit. Don't want to bring anything illegal, and I'm saying illegal under federal or state law. So just because something's legal in Vermont doesn't mean that, if federal officials arrest you, that's going to be fine. And basically anything you can't afford to lose or don't want the police to confiscate. Now, one question that I've been getting actually a lot in the last couple of weeks is about whistles. And this is actually kind of a tricky one to answer, surprisingly. Using whistles to alert others to nearby law enforcement activity may be useful to draw attention to abuses of power or signal others to begin documenting and recording. But I want to be clear, this choice does come with risks. And we just can't say how the courts will respond to a whistling case because there hasn't been a whistling lawsuit yet that we've seen. So we're kind of extrapolating from general First Amendment principles here. Now, you do have a First Amendment right to share or report information about how law enforcement are operating and what they're doing, and a First Amendment right to peaceful protest, including protesting ICE activity, silently or through communication that's intended to be heard by others. But you don't have a right to interfere or obstruct law enforcement performing their duties. So overall, whistles, when they're used to help communicate, to alert others, to start lawfully recording or documenting law enforcement, that's more likely to be viewed as First Amendment activity that's protected. But if you're using whistles to interfere with law enforcement operations, it is way less likely that a court is going to say that that is constitutionally protected. And the First Amendment does not allow you to help someone evade immigration enforcement if you know or recklessly disregard their immigration status. Next slide, please. So let's talk about protecting your privacy at a protest. The best tip is to not bring your phone. If you are like me, you are going to bring your phone anyway. So when you do, you'll want to turn off your biometric unlock functions. So if your phone opens with a fingerprint, or if you hold it up for Face ID, and that's how you open your phone, turn those features off ahead of time. The best way to protect your phone is with a passcode. And that is because we are not sure how the courts are going to respond if law enforcement were to take your phone and just hold it up to your face and unlock it. The best practice is use that passcode because that is keeping it most private. You also want to use encrypted messaging apps like Signal. Those are the most secure. Back up your phone first in case it is lost or broken. Put your phone in airplane mode if you want to protect your location. And be really cautious when you're taking photos and videos. And that is because just because you might feel comfortable having your presence at a protest known and documented, you don't know the citizenship status of the people around you, and you don't know if they have different risk tolerance about retaliation. So you can take pictures and photos of the people speaking, on a platform, pictures of some of the really creative signs that Vermonters are coming up with. But you don't want to take pictures of, other people's faces without their permission. Next slide, please. Now, what to do if you see ICE at a protest? You want to take a picture. If you want to document this, you can take a picture of the video or the agent, of a picture or video of the agents, but again, not the people they are targeting. And you can also alert local rapid response networks about ICE activity, including where you are, how many there are, what they're wearing, because again, they could just be wearing something that says police, what vehicles they're driving, what they're doing. Are they arresting someone? Are they patrolling the area? Do they have weapons? And are they collaborating with police? And in Vermont, again, that is crucially important because under our fair and impartial policing model, local Vermont law enforcement should not be assisting ICE in carrying out immigration enforcement. Next slide, please. Now, what to do if you are stopped by law enforcement? I want you to remember, law enforcement has a lot of power in these interactions. So our do's are stay calm and polite, keep your hands visible, you can always ask if you're free to go, and answer a few questions or remain silent. But do not lose your cool, walk or run away without asking if you're free to leave first. And that is because ICE is now claiming that if someone runs from them, that is evidence that they have, committed a crime or an immigration infraction. Typically, you don't want to consent to be searched. It's just generally not a good idea. You don't want to lie or provide fake documents. Do not touch the officers and do not physically resist. The time to oppose unlawful ICE action comes after the arrest. Now, I want to fully acknowledge that I recognize I am asking you to be responsible, calm, and polite, even if the officers are not. And that is really flips the script on how, the government officials are supposed to be treating members of the public. But the priority is keeping you and others around you safe. Next slide, please. Now, 5 key phrases I want you to have in your tool belt. First is, am I free to go? Ask this at any time, one of kind of the exceptions to remaining silent. I wish to remain silent. Always good to have in your pocket. I do not consent to this search. Am I under arrest? And I want to speak to a lawyer. The 2, 3, and 5 are clear declarative statements. First, if you want to remain silent, say that, and then don't say anything else. And am I free to go? And am I under arrest? Will give you important information about what ICE is actually doing in this interaction. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about what if you are arrested or witness an arrest and what comes after an arrest. Next slide, please. So if you are witnessing an arrest, if you are able and the person who's being arrested actually wants your support, you'll want to take note of the person's name, their date of birth, an emergency contact, medical conditions, and any gender identity. And then after the fact, you'll want to inform the emergency contact and potentially record the arrest. And next slide, please. Let's talk about how to record that arrest safely. When you are lawfully present in a public space, you have the right to photograph, record, live stream, anything that's in plain view, as long as you're not interfering with law enforcement actions. So you have the right to film an arrest in public as long as you're not interfering. And you'll want to film openly and from a safe distance, and also follow safety instructions. So if you're recording this arrest on your phone and the officers tell you to step back, the best advice we have is to take a step back, film yourself doing it, like point your phone towards your feet so you have record you took a step back, say I'm stepping back, and then continue filming. And just like when you're photographing, ICE at a protest, you'll want to focus on the police or ICE, not on the person who is being arrested. Now, despite what we are hearing ICE say, law enforcement does not have the right to confiscate your phone or your camera without a warrant, and they don't have the right to delete your footage. But you should also think really carefully before you share any footage. And that is because you don't know if the person who's being arrested is comfortable having that information shared on social media or in the news. So, the best practice is to contact, someone that person trusts to give them the right to decide what to do with the arrest information. You also don't want to edit any footage that you take because you want to be sure to preserve it in its original form in case it's used in court later to help that person who was arrested. Next slide, please. Now, let's say you couldn't record the arrest that was happening. You couldn't film it in real time. Maybe you were on private property where you didn't have, the owner's permission to be recording. Maybe there were safety concerns where it just didn't feel safe to have your camera out or to be close enough to capture what was happening, even with Zoom. Or, maybe you just weren't quick enough to get your phone out. That is okay. You can still help the person who's been arrested, and you can just take notes after the arrest instead. So mark down the location, the date and time of the arrest, what agency was it, how many officials were there, what were they wearing, did they have weapons, any documentation they showed, did they flash around a warrant, potential witnesses, or injuries or damages. All of that information can be used, down the line, and you want to get it on paper as soon as possible while your memory is as fresh as it can be. And regarding documentation specifically, anecdotally in Vermont, we know that the vast majority of the time, ICE does not actually have a warrant to be making these arrests. And if they do have a warrant, it's almost always just going to be that administrative warrant, not a judicial warrant. Next slide, please. Now, first, let's talk about what to do if you're arrested by police. You have the right to remain silent, and you can always refuse a search. They will, as we've said, likely search you for a weapon anyway. You also have the right to see a judge, typically within 24 to 48 hours of your arrest. You'll see a judge to hear what you're charged with and whether you'll be released or will have to pay bail. You also have the right to a lawyer. You can either hire one if you have enough money, or if you don't, you'll be assigned a criminal defense attorney who you'll probably meet actually at the hearing or right before it. Now, if you're a non-citizen, you also want to find an immigration attorney as soon as possible. And you should not plead guilty to anything without having your criminal defense attorney consult with your immigration attorney first. And that is because even if you plead guilty to really low-level crimes, that can have a huge implication for your immigration case and your ability to stay in the country long-term. Next slide, please. Now, what to expect if you are arrested by ICE? Again, you have the right to remain silent and can refuse a search. You do not have to provide your country of birth or citizenship or immigration status to anyone, and you don't need to sign anything either. You have the right to request a lawyer and contact your consulate. If you're being charged with an immigration violation, the government doesn't need to give you a free lawyer, so you can instead call your contacts to request legal assistance. Remember, if you're just talking to a friend to ask for a lawyer, that phone call can be recorded and monitored. That is not a private conversation like the way calls with attorneys are private. So you don't want to talk about the arrest until you're speaking just with your lawyer. You also have a right to some due process before you should be automatically deported. And that process really depends on how long you've been in the country. Now, I've been beating to death this idea that your right to remain silent is one of the best tools in your tool belt. But there's one exception that I want to flag, and that is if ICE already knows that you are a non-citizen and you are afraid of returning to your home country, you actually should say so. And that is because the right to request asylum is often not one that you are going to be offered. A lot of times you have to affirmatively say that you are afraid of being harmed if you're deported before you are put into a separate kind of asylum process to try to pursue that claim. Next slide, please. Now, that was essentially the legal lay of the land, but whether to exercise your rights is always going to be a choice that depends on your specific situation. So I want you to always think, can I exercise my rights safely? And how will me exercising my rights affect other safety? I also want you to just consider how your own power, privilege, and identity play into this. We know that Black and Brown people are being targeted and are most likely to have their rights violated, true in this moment and just true historically. So if white citizens are always just doing kind of what's easiest for them in those situations instead of actually asserting their rights, that means that the burden of holding the line is going to fall on the people who are already most at risk in this system. So we all have a shared responsibility to our democracy and to each other. And what we can safely do really depends on who we are, where we are, when we are in any given situation. So if you think that your rights have been violated, you want to write down what happened and include specific details like names, badge numbers, dates, and times. This is when you really want to think like a lawyer. You want to make a list of any potential witnesses, and you can report the violation to a lawyer or a civil rights organization. And you can also share your story with the ACLU of Vermont. We are launching either at the end of this week or early next, a new Share Your Story platform where you can go to our website, click on Share Your Story, and provide information that will help guide our legal advocacy and public education work. Next slide, please. So I just want to say thank you all so much for taking the time to become more informed and empowered to exercise your rights today. My hope is that some people, like walking away from this, really now feel like they know their rights and know how to assert them confidently. And I want to be clear, the Trump administration has done real harm, but it has also overpromised. And the only way that the Trump administration can deliver on its promises is if we help them by behaving as if our rights have already been stripped away. But we can encourage each other, our leaders, our legislators, our neighbor, and each other to all hold the line. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Morgan.